So I have to thank both speakers for very inspiring talks. First, perhaps I could ask Professor Robert Kowalski on this kind of logical English, which is, I think, easier to understand programs. And do you think that in the future there will be the possibility to write law in logical English, so we don't need this kind of transformation from the documents in English and translate it to logical English?
Well, I think logical English is going to be very hard to write. It's easy. It should be easy to read, but requires a lot of discipline to write correctly. What I anticipate is it's just like legislation. Well-written legislation can only be done by a very small number of very skilled people. Most people are very bad at writing.
That is the question. So if these very skilled people, could they write this in logical English in the future?
Well, so in a sense, you need a hybrid between programmers today who are able to write very precise, unambiguous, low-level code. Why should it be low-level? So they should have the ability to write higher-level code as well, which is natural language code. Okay. So this is, but in the meanwhile, it's to write good code is hard. So one of the solutions is that you have to have good examples. So this is I would say the bottleneck at the moment is we have very few examples of well-written, first of all, well-written natural language. I mean, the British Nationality Act is viewed in computational terms. It's written far better than any software engineer ever wrote any specification in English. It is very clearly, very precisely written. But we have to have examples, and people have to learn to write. I mean, I would say we have to teach children that language is not just poetry. Language also has meaning, and there is a gap in children's education. They're taught to write creatively and entertainingly. They're not taught that words have meanings and that sentences put meaning together. So, yeah, maybe that'll be a bottleneck. Thank you. That's a good question.
On the other side, it reminds me to many years ago when IBM started to formulate some logical rules for hit and run offenses. And this needs more than 1 year just to translate one paragraph.
Yeah.
So that would be too intensive for real world problems. So may I ask the audience for some questions to Professor Kowalski? Yeah, please.
Is English not an inherently bad language, to be precise, as opposed to German or French, for example?
Well, I learned Latin. Latin is a bit better than English because the syntactic cases in Latin are closer to the semantic meaning. So in English, there's a very rough correspondence between the prepositions and the syntax. So to, the for, of. These prepositions in English don't have a very clear semantics, whereas in Latin, the semantics is much more possessive. You have concept, possessive, locative, instrumental. So English may not be, well, so logical English, each preposition will have to have a clear semantic meaning. So English, I'm looking at a sub-language of English, but also from an expression and difficulty. One of the problems with writing logic, as you say at IBM, is that it's too restrictive. At the purely object level, you cannot talk about an obligation. You cannot mix meta level and object level. So there are restrictions that will be lifted from ordinary logic, but so we need to make logic less restrictive and English more restrictive. But I agree that English is only one example that I know better than other languages. But I'd like to know a more logical language.
I think it's from a user perspective, writing, for example, a contract in English as opposed to writing a contract in German. Writing it in German, you'd get by with much fewer definitions and clarifications than I would in English. And then the discussing afterwards, the negotiation, I find there's just much more use of softener words, like a reasonable time frame and nonsense like that. So is it the user or is it the language?
Well, there's a style, there's stylistic, there's a stylistic element. What style do you use in whatever language you have? And the same is true in logical English. There are many styles, like it is obligatory that is one style, but it is an obligation that. And one style offers more expressive capability and means you can express things which are harder in more traditional logic. But I mean, I agree, I would love to find a more logical, natural language than English. And I've been looking for them, but there's very little analysis as far. I mean, I've been told, for example, that Chinese is more logical than English, but I don't know.
Professor Matthes has a remark on this.
Yeah, so I think the interesting point is, the funny thing is, computer scientists and lawyers, they are the most hated groups in a company. Yeah, so the lawyers do things that nobody understands, and they always say it's impossible. So it's the cliche. And then the computer science, they build software nobody understands, and that breaks. Yeah. So therefore, but now I think the future will be the case that actually we will write these smart contracts for derivatives, or we have maybe the calculation of the bonus of a sales employee. So these are things which are calculated. So we have algorithms. So I see the future that we will not first, that we also have a situation where we have, let's say, a decision system at the university, whether somebody is accepted or not. Yeah? And there somebody will write a code that executes this, and now we have the need that somebody can understand what this code is doing. Yeah? So therefore I could also see a situation where such a structured language and a structured design of programming language might help to have code which is executable in the first place to make it understandable. Yeah? Because currently you have textual descriptions, requirements, and then some magic creative process to create code which is tested to be something. And it would be nice to look at the code in a way that a lawyer or law expert with some training could understand what's going on, because it's better to understand. And then I totally agree with you that maybe some of these machine systems are maybe not the easiest way to understand it. Yeah? And we have a lot of automation everywhere around us, and so therefore it would be nice that this automation can be understood, the rules at least.
I think in some way language in law is the most viable way for translation, because we have already the Dictatom, etc. And if we look to Google Translate, the first corpora used was the corpora of the Canadian Parliament, and this was the impetus to do further. That this was this groundbreaking work of Franz Joseph Ochs to say, okay, we just take the corpora in French and the corpora in English, and then let machine learn. And this is the starting point of Google Translate, for example. So in some way, language has some logic behind, as you have pointed out. Are there some? Please.
I actually got two questions, one for Professor Matthes and one for Professor Kowalski. The one question for Professor Matthes would be, you're talking about the legal departments and of the companies as the major customers. Don't you think it is very important, or it would be more important also to include general managers and the CEOs, because they also need to know what's going on, especially in the legal tech development, talking about logical English, logical German, or however you might call it, the logic language behind it, because I think otherwise they don't understand the vastness of what's coming on here to all the companies, because I don't think that there would happen anything bad by having an unfiltered or unbiased, intentionally anything. But if you get filtered messages or biased messages, I think they need to know what's going on. Do you include them? That's the basic questions. Do you include the CEOs in all your lectures and in all your group discussions that you have when you talk about corporations?
So implicitly, I think, for example, all these compliance what Align is doing. These are spin-off of McKinsey, etc. So there's a huge pain now with the DSGVO and all these compliance regulations that they hit immediately the board of directors. So therefore, they are responsible, which is good. Yeah? And that makes them highly interested in what's going on in the legal department and with compliance. Yeah? I think that was a strategic move, which is very well done, on also increasing the fines for violations. Yeah? So therefore, they are motivated this way. But nevertheless, they want to push it down because obviously it's not doable. So therefore, what we now need somehow is this chain of responsibility. And then again, these are classical, so you want to partition now the company that with enterprise architecture and say, okay, what are our processes and where can anything go wrong? So therefore, you have this classical idea of separating the capabilities of the organization and then having processes in place to educate people, to train people, to observe stuff. So therefore, I think there's a high interest of the top management to have automation there and dashboards and magic things which somehow make sure that the people do the right things. And there are, for example, initiatives in Daimler, BMW and Volkswagen that they have a shared database of legal regulations worldwide affecting cars. Yeah, because there are so many countries, who should know what is now the last regulation in South Korea? So therefore, they have a shared interest, cross-organizational, to build a shared database of regulations so that they then can inform the stakeholders that there's a new regulation out there. Yeah? So I think we are now, and since the problem is so large, there are so many countries, so many parts and pieces in a car, so many software in the car, they now have to find IT solutions to help them managing the laws. What is written there? Is it about the light? Is it about the distance to the bottom of the car? Is it the combustion exhaust? So that's, I think, the problem, that we now have day-to-day a vast problem of regulating organizations, and the organizations now need some support. And currently it's done with a lot of internal lawyers and managers to do the right thing at scale. Yeah? And so that would be my answer, that they are very much motivated. They also are willing to pay money, which is what I say. Yeah? So there is a lot of money for this big four to do this and to check that there's regulation, because if they checked it, they showed that they are investing in it. Yeah, so there's easily earned money in this field with rather stupid things. Yeah, it's checkboxes, checklists, they have been trained, they have been expressed. You know what I mean?
And your question to
And my second question to Professor Kowalski would be, when we talk about this logic language, if everything comes down to then somehow to artificial intelligence somehow, artificial intelligence with this if-so-then relations, how will they be able to include ethical things? When we're talking about autonomous cars, for instance, there must be a decision. I think about a road with just autonomous cars driving, and then there is this famous situation, there's something happens because a little child runs into the street, and how will the algorithm then be programmed? Will the algorithm just then protect then its own driver, or will it bump into the little child, or so on? So my question is, I guess a really big one, how will you be able, or how will science be able to include the ethical questions then into this logics, into this semantic programming when we talk about artificial intelligence?
Okay, this is a much bigger question than my talk, but it is a question which I addressed in my book on computational logic and human thinking. Logic is one of two main components that go into human behavior, and the other is rationality as understood by psychologists and economists. So in artificial intelligence and in the academic community, these two fields are more or less disjoint, although they do come together to some extent in artificial intelligence, where models have been built of human thinking, which can be implemented by for computer thinking, which incorporate both logic and decision theory and game theory. So ethics involves the choice of actions when there are several actions that can be plans of actions which have uncertain consequences, and the choice needs to be made based upon the expected, let's call it utility of the alternatives, where utility will differ depending upon your ethical considerations and your values. So in the academic community, as I say, these fields have been, the economists know nothing about logic, the logicians have never heard of decision theory, and there's the only work I know of is the work in artificial intelligence that tries to bring the two together. So, in fact, in a way, artificial intelligence offers more hope for ethical decision making because it incorporates both logic and decision theory, whereas the academic fields are almost totally disjointed.
Just perhaps a question. So if we speak about this kind of intent, could Speech Act be part of a solution?
Well, speech acts are between different agents. So things get complicated when there are several agents with different goals. And when each, let's say, of two agents, when they have conflicting goals and conflicting actions, so if you can communicate your intentions, your reasons for wanting to perform one course of action as opposed to another, then you can perhaps find a middle way which achieves the goals of different agents, but in different ways from originally intended, if you don't communicate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, some other questions from the audience?
Sorry, in argumentation, okay, that's another thing. There's been a lot of advances in artificial intelligence in argumentation theory. So in recent 20 years, I'd say, the field of argumentation has been developed most deeply in the field of artificial intelligence. I'm thankful to have contributed to that with Fan Minh Dung, who's the main contributor to that. And now, that's been primarily done from a logical perspective, argumentation theory as in logic, but we're now looking at the relationship between argumentation and decision theory. So typically, in some ways, decision theory is more powerful than argumentation. This is just a new field within artificial intelligence, which is very promising.
Some other question from the audience? If not, perhaps a question to Matthes. In one of your last slides, you mentioned what can we learn from other ecosystems. Yeah? And what I like very much is, in the first place, you put this kind of open shared source, but also open shared data. Could you comment a little bit more in depth on this and standardization? I think that these three fields could be essential for innovative development, also in the legal area.
Yeah, I think with open source, as you also mentioned it, so for example, what we want to have is, on the one hand side, it could be implementations of rules, etc., or rule engines, or reasoning tools, so that would be the open source character, that you have a reusable solution for a recurring problem at a very low level, sentence boundary detection, OCR, translation services, etc. So these would be the building blocks where I see a chance that if they are developed at scale with companies with a lot of money, like Google, etc., for them it's a very natural idea to make them open source or make the service very cost effective. So that would be the low-level services. And then the added value, which is then relevant for niches, can then be done by small companies, because they build on the shoulder of giants, on the real code, and building user front ends to do this for a specific legal domain, etc. And then again, the question is, what is the classical way where humans create code, and the value is in the code or in the data models? That would be the typical way. And if you have then machine learning, it's even more so that the data becomes important, because then you want to go to Datev, which is a support company in Germany. If you do a text declaration, and they have millions of cases how text declarations have been done in the past, and this is their treasure, more or less. They know how they did it in the past, and if you interview the people there, they say, for us it would be very easy if you get a document to make the right Rechnungsverbuchung. Yeah? So they say if we have this tech data, how these cases have been handled in the past, or we had projects with Check24 where you have a lot of customer communication. If you switch from one energy provider to the other, you get a lot of questions, how this is done and what went wrong, etc. And they classified the past communications. You have hundreds, thousands of interactions, and if you have these speech acts, it's very easy for you, based on this data, to create a robot that suggests what to do with high probability, and then you either press the button and say, yeah, I answer like in the past, or I change it. And so therefore data is now the new gold here, as long as it's not person-centered. Yeah? If it's data about people, I always say data is the new asbestos, because nobody wants to have personally identifiable data, like mobility data, or individual cases where people are involved in court rulings. So therefore also anonymization services would be something which would be very highly beneficial, that you could give anonymization services to the courts so that they can anonymize the judgments so that researchers can work on them, because currently we don't get them because the data is in their hands. And so that's what I mean, yeah? So that some of these algorithms and some of this data could be very beneficial to open the data but then you have the IP rights of the publishing houses, yeah, which say, oh, we own the data. And these are the current points we have in legal tech, that the ownership of data is something which is not very evenly distributed.
And open data is more than this, because we need also the right ontologies. No?
Exactly. Yeah.
Which could be perhaps also
And that's, for example, what I'm always training at this Denkfabrik Legal Tech. So we have the Landesanwaltskammer, we have the notaries, we have the patent offices. So we have a lot of state-funded places which want to do machine learning. And I say, if each of you funds now individual projects, and also you give now your data to IBM, yeah? So because IBM often has these contracts and say, okay, if you train now the system, the training data belongs to us. I say, this is the worst thing you can do, because you make your suppliers richer and richer. You should more or less keep this data and share it with the other institutions, yeah? Verbraucherschutzverband Hamburg, with Verbraucherschutzverband Bremen, Verbraucherschutzverband Bayern. And they do individual projects, and my main mantra is you create data, you create algorithms, and you should own this, and you should share it with your public administration peers, because they can benefit from it. But in the other hand, they say, oh, we are not IT experts, we cannot do this. Yeah? And therefore, I mean, we have to reorganize this market, that they more or less think in terms of reusable components, standards, collaboration on the customer side for the public sector, which is easier to do in this area. And that's what I mean with open data in this area.
That could be a European task. Even.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yes, please.
You're saying data is the new gold, and I think this is exactly the sentence which does not open data, because every company and everyone is then thinking, oh, my data is the new gold, so I have to protect it for the others, because maybe in the future I earn a lot of money out of this data I have.
Sure. So, but therefore I also mentioned that
very dangerous sentence.
I take it back. So you're right. Gold is either I have gold or you have gold. It's a zero-sum game. Data is not a zero-sum game. If many people have data, they can collaboratively use it. It's not either me or them, but if we together use it in cooperative. So, sorry, maybe the gold thing, I just mentioned it, but I agree. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I agree, because I heard this sentence quite often, and this protects you more to share the data than to have it because you think that you lose money maybe in the future, and if you think about lose money in the future, you will not give it for free.
I think that is a very European problem. So we have so many small or medium enterprises with a lot of data which cannot be shared because they belong to the USB. And now there are, I think, just to say, very nice approaches how to use AI in a way to anonymize this data. Because using this kind of deep convolution networks, it is something like an encryption per se. So if you put this data together from the different SMEs, this could be, and then there are even some patents on this, that is even could be translated to advanced geometry. So KI could even be how to say, an enabler of putting data together, even of smaller enterprises. And that is a real nice research going on.
But again, the problem now, so there's a project it's called Differential Privacy, and Facebook is funding now TU Munich to investigate this. If you have very large numbers of data, then you can provably create changes in this data that individual data items cannot be identified in patient records. And unfortunately, this only works if you have very much data. Yeah? So therefore, again, what you need is you have to be a player like Google, Facebook, Apple, which have large amounts of data. And again, now it would help if we have cooperatives that German small, medium-sized enterprises would say, okay, maybe we put our small things together and create now these large data sets in which we can do these anonymization techniques. But again, it's a new way of thinking. I agree that maybe this idea of gold leads into a different direction. So like Gollum, Maischatz. Yeah. So that I should keep it.
It's gold and asbestos, I should. Is there some last question here? Yes, please.
I just want to add some point here from a legal publisher perspective, because I think you're totally right when you're saying that the technology, the barrier to adopting technology is getting lower and lower, because the big companies are providing the platform to do that. But you never know what will happen in the future when they are changing their business model, for example. So maybe you end up in the same situation as in the data perspective, where few big companies own the platforms, and you are relying on those platforms.
So I think we are, I don't know, we are running out of time. It's okay, yeah? So, yeah?
I think this is again what you have posted in your talk, that the data must be shared.
Open data. Yeah.
Take your data out of one platform and put it to the next one. So this is of the interoperability of the data, so that you really can take your data with you, which is now the case, for example, of your bank account or some new things, and it will be more and more with other services, but currently this is not the case.
Okay. Well, then thank you. I need to unfortunately stop you here because so far we are good in time. 2 or 3 remarks. One is actually the issue of anonymizing data and using it and feeding it into the system is a topic at tomorrow's workshop of Mr. Langthaler as well, where we, from the Austrian Informatics Center, and our situation in Austria is a bit better than in Germany because all court judgments, for example, as they are published by the RIS system, are available. So it's less of a restricted system. The second thing is, if you're really interested in logic, language, and law, there's an interesting author to read after, that's Lawrence Lessig of Harvard, before Stanford, who writes about code is law. So if you have time, Google Lawrence Lessig and code is law. There's this interesting notion, which in particular for compliance is very important, whether or not, for example, you can word your compliance regulations so that you can automate them, which is an interesting theory, and I think probably workable, probably not so much for normal law. And the most important thing is now we have a coffee break. Thank you very much for your attention so far. I would be really grateful if you could be back in time at 4:15, so 16:15, 4:15, please. Thank you. And an applause to our panel, please.